Anima, Gate of Memories is an action RPG that follows a woman known only as the Bearer, as she tries to recover a mysterious book that was stolen from her order by a traitor and finds herself trapped in a mysterious tower known as Arcane. There she learns that she will need to defeat the 5 Messengers of the End, whose gathering is prophesied to bring about the end of the world. She makes her way through 5 mysterious worlds built from the memories of the messengers themselves, battling monsters and magical constructs with the power she draws from the demon Ergo Mundus, who is trapped in a book the Bearer always carries with her. The game has a lot of combat, some exploration puzzles, and even some platforming. None of it is very good, but, you know, it's varied. That's something, right? In combat, you have a standard combo attack, as well as unlockable techniques like attacks to launch enemies in the air or lunge at them from long distance. And there are several magic abilities that include both attacks and temporary buffs. You have a quick evasion move with some pretty generous invincibility frames to it, and you can also use it in response to damage to quickly recover from attacks. You have stamina and mana bars that govern your ability to use physical and magical attacks respectively. At any time, you can switch between controlling the Bearer or Ergo. They play extremely similarly, with Ergo somewhat favoring melee attacks and the Bearer relying a bit more on ranged attacks. Switching characters in the middle of attacks will cause the character switch to execute one of their own attacks, based on the attack you switched characters from. The characters each have their own life bar, but they share stamina and mana. At its core, Anima's combat isn't too bad, but as it iterates on it as the game progresses, its flaws become more and more apparent. A lot of enemies in this game just like to pelt you with projectiles, which will send you flying anytime they hit you. You can intercept enemy projectiles with your own, but that's almost never a useful strategy as a lot of enemies can fire their projectiles much more quickly than you can. So the only response in a lot of these instances is to just spam the dodge, which is stupid. And a lot of the game's combat encounters have enemies spawning in around you, so you frequently end up being surrounded by off-screen projectile attackers, which is pretty frustrating. The melee combat has its problems too, but it's not as annoying as the ranged combat. You can hold the button down to execute the combo, which I really appreciate, and the game does a good job of letting you weave in alternate abilities to mix up your attacks, which is cool. If you get the hang of what each attack threads into, the ability to switch characters mid-combo can be very fun too. But combos kind of frequently don't work the way you want them to. Even point blank, sometimes your attacks will knock the enemy back so as to be out of reach of your next hit. And it's very easy to accidentally change your facing while attacking, even if you use lock-on. So a lot of your attacks won't connect when it feels like they should. This isn't helped by the fact that it's kind of difficult to judge the hit area of many of the attacks. You can cover a lot of ground using the lunge attack, but the game pretty much decides for you what it's going to target. The same actually goes for the projectiles, but with the lunge you can easily find yourself moved into a position you didn't want to be in because it targeted the wrong enemy. And the game's camera is zoomed in way too far considering how often the game puts you in positions where you're surrounded, and it can be difficult to tell how many and what types of enemies are around you. And even a lot of melee-focused enemies attack you by lunging at you from a distance, so you can take a lot of unfair seeming hits from enemies that are outside of your view. For such a small project, there are a lot of different enemy types though, including quite a few mini-bosses, and there are some pretty interesting designs both visually and mechanically. And the main boss fights are pretty well designed as well, but bosses have a lot more health than necessary and these fights can really drag on. They're also pretty difficult, even without the length, and I can't ignore the likely intentional 4 Kings of New Wando vibe I get from, I don't know, Pumpkinhead McGee over here. As you defeat enemies you gain experience and level up, and both characters share the experience level. You can use the skill points you earn to unlock and improve new attacks and passive abilities for each character individually. I like having skill trees, but there isn't much interesting you can do with these ones. Having them separated for the 2 characters allows you to focus on specializing each of them in certain areas at first, but as you progress through the levels they'll end up with about the same, except for the few unique skills each has. I like being in control of how the characters develop, but there isn't much you can do in that regard here. The game is broken up into 5 main worlds, accessed from the hub, Arcane. Each of these worlds represents the memories of the boss that you're hunting there, and they're pretty well designed. It's clear the game was pretty low budget, but it still makes smart use of its resources by having some distinctly designed areas. And the stories you uncover about the messengers that govern the areas are very interesting. The game's story, however, is not good. Aside from the plot being a lot more convoluted than it needs to be, it uses a lot of tired tropes and plot twists, and the writing is terrible. And that's not just the story writing. Hell, I can overlook a poorly written story, that's par for the medium at this point. But there's also humor. I don't even want to dignify a lot of it by reproducing it here. Let me put it this way. It's at the point where I would have just preferred memes. I would have cringed less at finding Dat Boy plastered on a wall or something than I did from the game's earnest attempts at humor. That's actually impressive if you think about it. And Ergo is probably the most unintentionally annoying video game character in quite a while. And while I'm on the topic of things that are horrible, there's platforming. Your jump arc is very narrow and it's difficult to get a sense of how much distance it covers, and it's also hard to judge depth when trying to land on platforms with the way the camera is. And of course they like to throw in things that make the bad platforming even more frustrating, like timed disappearing platforms or complex moving platforms. Can we just stop putting platforming in games that are not platformers? Just like with seeing a lot of unnecessary RPG elements in games that aren't RPGs, having platforming in games that aren't platformers is just annoying. The music in Anima is pretty unremarkable, though not bad, though I do really like the title screen theme. The voice acting is, though. I don't want to blame the actors themselves though, it feels more like bad directing, like everything was done in one take. There are parts where different characters will pronounce a name differently, and there are plenty of differences between the text and the actual voiceover. It really didn't need voice acting at all. It's a digital-only release, for crying out loud. You can get away with not having voice acting. I'm going to be generous and edge out my score for Anima Gate of Memories to a 2 out of 4. The combat is okay, usually, and there are some interesting stories to the areas you explore, but the game's plot is awful, the platforming sucks, and I just really hate Ergo. The game is interesting and creative, I'll give it that, and that is something I appreciate. I'm interested in seeing this team make other things, but it needs to be better than this. It's difficult for me to recommend this game. If you like action RPGs and have low standards, give it a shot, I guess? Anyway, thanks for watching. There's plenty more reviews on the way, so you can subscribe if you're not already sick of hearing my voice. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to tell you what to do. But seriously, subscribing would be a cool thing to do.